The sun hung low over the wastelands, burning the desert in a dull orange haze. Caleb Mercer rode slow, the horse's hooves crunching over dry earth and broken glass from old wagon wheels. The air was still, too still, no wind, no birds, not even the buzz of flies. Just silence. He had seen this kind of silence before. It meant death wasn't far behind. He pulled his horse to a stop near a charred wagon that looked like it had been hit by bandits days ago. The wood was blackened, the ground around it scattered with torn cloth and empty shells. Caleb scanned the area, hand resting lightly on the worn grip of his revolver. His heartbeat stayed steady, calm, trained, cold. He'd been through worse. But his eyes moved carefully, searching for movement. Then he saw her. A small figure sitting in the dirt beside the wreckage, half covered in ash. A little girl, barefoot, hair tangled, face streaked with dust. She clutched a broken doll to her chest, staring at the ground. Caleb dismounted slowly. The leather of his coat creaked as his boots touched the ground. The girl didn't flinch. She just sat there, quiet, like she'd run out of fear. He knelt a few steps away. "You alone out here?" His voice came out rough from dust and disuse. The girl looked up. Her eyes, gray-blue, wide but dry, met his. She didn't speak. Caleb let out a long breath, glanced around again. There were signs of struggle, drag marks, a trail leading off into the rocks. He could tell what happened. Raiders hit the wagon, maybe for supplies. No one survived. He'd seen too many of these scenes to count. He looked back at the girl. Something in her face, not panic, not tears, just emptiness, got under his skin. He didn't have time for this. He should get back on his horse and keep riding west, away from trouble. But he didn't move. He took his canteen and set it on the ground in front of her. "Water?" he said simply. She hesitated, then crawled forward and drank, slow and careful, as if she thought he might take it back. Caleb watched her hands, small, scraped, trembling a little. She was maybe 6 or 7. He wondered how long she'd been sitting here. After a while, he asked quietly, "Got a name?" She looked up again. "Annie," she said. Her voice was small but steady. Caleb nodded once. "You got anyone left, Annie?" She shook her head. The sound of it, just that soft shake, made the silence heavier. He straightened up, rubbing the back of his neck. He didn't know what the hell he was supposed to do now. Take her to the next town? Leave her with someone? Every decision he'd made for the last 10 years had been about staying alone. It was safer that way. But leaving her here wasn't something he could make himself do. He looked down at her again. "You can't stay here," he said. "It ain't safe." Annie hugged her doll tighter and nodded as if she already knew that. He sighed, stepped back to his horse and grabbed a blanket from the saddlebag. When he came back, he draped it around her shoulders. The fabric looked too big on her, swallowing her whole. She glanced up at him again, and for a second, there was something like trust in her eyes. "Come on," he said, holding out his hand. "We'll find someplace better." She hesitated, then took it. Her small fingers barely wrapped around his. As he lifted her onto the horse, he felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear exactly, but something close. The kind of feeling that made him remember how much he'd lost, how much he'd shut out. He climbed up behind her, adjusted the reins, and turned toward the horizon. The sun was fading, leaving the sky bruised and red. Annie leaned back against him, silent, tired. Caleb didn't look back at the burnt wagon. He just said quietly, almost to himself, "All right, kid. Let's ride." The horse moved forward, slow and steady, through the dying light. One man, one child, and a road that offered nothing but dust and silence. But for the first time in years, Caleb wasn't running away from something. He was riding toward something, even if he didn't know what it was yet. The first lights of Red Hollow showed up as the sun began to die behind the mountains. A handful of oil lamps flickering in windows, dust blowing through empty streets, a dog barking somewhere in the dark. The place looked tired, half alive, the kind of town that kept its head down and its doors locked after sundown. Caleb guided the horse slowly down the main street. Annie sat in front of him, her small hands gripping the saddle horn, her head leaning against his chest. She hadn't spoken in hours. He could feel her breathing, steady, quiet, the rhythm of someone too exhausted to be afraid anymore. The townsfolk who were still out stopped to stare. A man covered in dust and gunmetal, carrying a child who didn't belong to him, it was enough to make anyone whisper. Caleb ignored them. He'd lived too long under stairs like that to care. He stopped outside the livery stable and dismounted, lifting Annie gently down. She blinked at the lights of the town, holding his hand like she was afraid the ground might open under her feet. A stable boy, maybe 16, walked out from the shadows. "Evenin'," he said, uncertain. His eyes moved from Caleb's gun belt to the girl, then back again. You lookin' for a room, mister? Maybe, Caleb said. You got a boarding house still open? The boy nodded toward the far end of the street. Cross Place. Widow runs it. Decent food. Keeps clean. Caleb gave a short nod, slipped the boy a coin and took Annie's hand again. Her fingers were cold, but she didn't pull away. They walked together past the saloon, where piano music leaked into the street, soft, uneven, the sound of a man playing for no one. Laughter came from inside, sharp and drunk. Caleb felt the familiar tension in his shoulders, the instinct to stay alert, to measure every voice, every shadow. When they reached the end of the street, he saw the sign, Cross Boarding House. The porch was lit by a single lantern. A woman stood there, arms folded, watching him approach. Evelyn Cross. She looked like someone who hadn't had an easy day in years, or maybe hadn't expected one. Her hair was tied back, but a few strands had escaped, brushing against her cheek. She wore a faded brown skirt and a white blouse with the sleeves rolled to her elbows. There was a streak of flour on her hand. Evening, she said, her tone cautious. We don't get many new faces this late. Caleb stopped a few feet from the porch. Need a room for the night, he said simply. The kid too. Evelyn's eyes moved to Annie. The hardness in her face softened a little. She yours? No, Caleb said after a pause. Found her out near Providence Road. Wagon hit by raiders. The woman's mouth tightened. I heard about that. They said no one made it. Someone did, he said, glancing at the girl. Evelyn looked at them for a long moment, weighing the risk. Then she sighed, turned toward the door and said, Come in. Inside, the air smelled like bread and wood smoke. The room was plain but warm, a small fire in the hearth, a few tables, a coat hanging by the stairs. Annie's eyes darted around, uncertain but curious. Caleb watched her, noticing the way she held the doll tighter, like it was her last piece of safety. Evelyn poured a cup of water and set it on the table. You both look half dead, she said. Sit. Caleb stayed standing for a moment, scanning the room, then finally sat. His body ached from the ride. Annie climbed onto the chair beside him, her legs swinging. Evelyn leaned against the counter. What's your name? Caleb Mercer. Her eyebrows rose slightly. Mercer, you been through here before? No, he said. Don't plan on staying long. She nodded slowly, eyes narrowing just enough to show she didn't fully believe him. You running from something? Running to something, he said quietly. That answer made her pause. Something in the way he said it, calm, certain but heavy, stopped her from asking more. She turned away, filling a small bowl with stew and setting it in front of Annie. She eats first, Evelyn said. Annie looked up, unsure. Caleb gave a small nod. Go on, he said. The girl ate slowly, polite, like she didn't want to seem greedy. Watching her, Caleb felt that same unfamiliar pull in his chest, guilt, maybe, or something close to it. He'd seen too many kids buried by this land. He wasn't going to let this one join them. Evelyn caught him watching the child and studied his face in silence. She could tell he wasn't a simple drifter. His coat was worn but clean, his revolver well kept. The kind of man who'd seen things but didn't talk about them. Dangerous but not cruel. When Annie finished eating, Caleb said quietly, Thank you. Evelyn nodded. Room's upstairs. You can pay in the morning. He stood, adjusting his hat. Appreciate it. As they headed for the stairs, Evelyn called out softly, Mercer. He turned. If the sheriff comes asking questions, I didn't see you, she said. But I don't want trouble here. He held her gaze. Neither do I. Their eyes lingered for a second longer than either expected. There was something in that silence. Not attraction yet, but awareness. Two people who'd both lost too much, recognizing the same kind of damage. Caleb led Annie upstairs. When the door closed, Evelyn stayed by the counter, staring at the empty chairs, listening to the fire crackle. She told herself she'd just taken in a man and a child who needed a bed. But she already knew it wasn't that simple. The next morning came with the sound of a rooster and the faint creak of a wagon somewhere outside. Caleb woke early out of habit. He lay still for a few seconds, his eyes on the cracks in the wooden ceiling, listening to the quiet breathing of the child asleep in the small bed beside him. Annie had curled up under the blanket, one hand clutching her doll, her face peaceful for the first time since he'd found her. He sat up, pulled on his boots, and washed his face in the basin by the window. The cold water helped clear the fog in his head. He looked at himself in the cracked mirror, the rough stubble, the lines around his eyes, the small scar running down his cheek. He didn't look like someone a child should trust, but somehow she did. That scared him more than any gunfight ever had. Downstairs, the smell of coffee and fried bread filled the air. Evelyn was already up, sleeves rolled, hair tied back tighter than last night. She glanced up when he came down the stairs. "You're up early," she said. "Always am," he replied. His voice was calm, even, but there was something in his tone that made her look at him a second longer. Annie came down a few minutes later, rubbing her eyes. Evelyn set a plate in front of her. "Eat," she said gently. "Then I'll find you something clean to wear. You can't run around in those rags forever." The girl smiled faintly, shy but thankful. Caleb noticed. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," Evelyn answered. "But I will." The silence between them wasn't cold, just heavy, like both were trying to figure out how to read the other. When breakfast was over, Evelyn wiped her hands and nodded toward the door. "I could use help on the ranch," she said. "Fences need fixing, water troughs cleaned. You look like you can work." "I can," he said simply. "Then work for food and a bed," she said. "No questions asked. Deal?" Caleb nodded. "Deal." Outside the morning was crisp. Dust hung low over the fields, the sound of horses echoing from the corral. The ranch stretched far, worn fences, a few cattle, the land dry but alive. Caleb rolled up his sleeves and got to work without a word. He carried heavy planks, tightened wire, replaced posts. Evelyn kept her distance at first, watching from the porch, one hand shading her eyes. She wasn't used to seeing a man work quietly. Most talked too much, bragged too often, or expected something in return. This one just moved, steady, focused, like every motion was measured. When she brought him a canteen of water, he took it with a nod. Their fingers brushed briefly, not intentional but enough to catch both their attention. Evelyn pulled her hand back quickly. "Thanks," he said. "Don't mention it," she replied, turning away. Her heartbeat had quickened for no reason she wanted to admit. By midday, Annie was running around the corral, laughing for the first time. She tried to feed one of the horses, her small hands shaking as she held out the hay. The horse sniffed it and nudged her shoulder. Caleb stopped working, watching. "She's got spirit," Evelyn said, standing beside him. "Yeah," he replied quietly. "More than most grown folks I've met." Evelyn glanced at him, studying his face, the small lift of his mouth that might have been the start of a smile. "She looks up to you," she said. "She shouldn't," he said. His tone was even, but his eyes were distant. "Why?" "Because I've done things no kid should look up to." Evelyn didn't answer right away. "You took her in when no one else would," she finally said. "That counts for something." Caleb looked at her then. The wind lifted the edge of her hair, and for a moment neither of them moved. There was a quiet understanding between them, not forgiveness, not attraction, not yet. Just two people recognizing that the world had taken its share from both. By late afternoon, the sun burned low and orange. Sweat and dust clung to Caleb's skin, his shirt sticking to his back. He leaned against the fence post he'd just repaired, breathing slow and steady. Evelyn brought out a plate of bread and salted meat. "You don't have to feed me twice in one day," he said. "You worked for it," she replied. They ate in silence. Annie sat nearby, humming to herself. The light hit Evelyn's face in a way that softened it, less guarded, more human. Caleb noticed but said nothing. After a while, Evelyn broke the silence. "You planning on staying here long?" "Until the girl's safe," he said. "And then?" He shrugged. "Then I move on." Evelyn nodded slowly, her jaw tightening. "Well, for now there's work if you want it. I'll take it." As the sun dipped below the ridge, Caleb put away the tools and walked Annie back to the house. The sky turned deep red, the wind picking up dust from the road. Evelyn watched them go, the quiet gunslinger and the barefoot child, and she felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. Maybe trust. Maybe danger. Inside, Caleb helped Annie wash up and settle into bed. When she finally fell asleep, he sat by the window, the faint glow from the lantern casting light on his hands that had killed, now rough from work instead of war. He wasn't sure why he'd stayed. Maybe for the girl. Maybe because Evelyn Cross looked at him without flinching. Maybe because, for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a ghost. Downstairs, Evelyn closed the ledger she'd been pretending to read. The sound of Annie's laughter from earlier still lingered in her ears. She thought about Caleb's calm voice, his tired eyes, and the quiet strength that seemed to steady the air around him. Outside, the crickets started their song. Inside, two people tried not to think about the same thing, that the peace they'd found that day felt too fragile to last. The day was hot, the kind of heat that pressed down on Red Hollow and made everyone move slower, speak quieter. Caleb worked along the east pasture, tightening fence wire, the sweat running into his eyes, burning, mixing with the dust caked on his skin. Annie ran alongside him, trying to keep up, but stumbling over the uneven ground. Caleb caught her hand mid-fall and steadied her. "Careful," he said quietly. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly as he saw her safe, but he couldn't ignore the small flinch in her eyes, the same look he'd seen in the desert, alone at the wagon. By mid-afternoon, he paused and leaned on the fence post, taking in a shallow breath. He knew people were watching. In towns like Red Hollow, strangers drew attention fast, and men like him, covered in scars and suspicion, drew more. Sheriff Langford had probably already heard whispers of Caleb Mercer showing up with a child in tow. That thought alone kept him alert, scanning every shadow, measuring every sound. Evelyn appeared at the corral gate, wiping her hands on her skirt. She hadn't called, hadn't announced herself. She just watched. Caleb noticed the small furrow between her brows, the way her jaw tightened slightly. "You're still here," she said, but there was no accusation in her voice, just observation. "I work for my keep," he said, adjusting his hat. His eyes didn't leave the fence line. She stepped closer, just out of reach of the horses, and glanced at Annie. "She looks better," she said. Her tone softened, and for a brief moment, Caleb let himself notice the warmth in her voice. It wasn't just kindness, it was careful, measured concern. "She's strong," he said. "She's got a long way to go, but she'll be fine." Evelyn's gaze flicked up to him, steady and curious. "You don't talk much," she said. "Not much to say," he replied. His words were clipped, careful. But inwardly he questioned whether he could trust her. Every time he'd opened up before, someone had taken advantage, left him worse than before. And yet he found himself answering, even if only minimally. The air between them held a quiet tension, not romantic, not yet, but charged. The way she watched him, the way he observed her every movement, it felt like a silent conversation neither wanted to voice. Annie, oblivious, chased a wayward calf down the pasture. Caleb tensed, ready to intervene, but Evelyn beat him to it. She raised her voice sharply, calling the child back. Annie skidded to a stop, eyes wide, then ran toward her, laughing nervously. Caleb's shoulders relaxed slightly. She had a protective instinct he hadn't counted on, and he found himself respecting it more than he expected. After the calf was rounded up, Evelyn approached him again. "You should rest," she said. "Heat will kill more than horses today." Caleb shook his head. "I'll take care of it." "Look," she said, lowering her voice, stepping a little closer, "I don't trust many people around here, but I trust you, with her. And that's not easy." The words hung in the heat like a weight. Caleb's heart ticked faster, not from fear, not from guilt, but from something he hadn't felt in years, recognition. He wasn't just a man passing through anymore. Someone relied on him. Someone chose, in this quiet, indirect way, to rely on him. "I'm not planning on letting anyone hurt her," he said, voice steady but low. Evelyn nodded, her lips pressed in a thin line. She looked down at her hands, then back at him, and for a fraction of a second, she let herself relax. "Good," she said. A silence fell. The wind kicked up dust from the corral, and Caleb noticed the faint tremor in her shoulders, a subtle sign of exhaustion, worry, and something else he couldn't name. He realized that, in some unspoken way, they were both guarding each other. Not with words, but with observation, with careful distance. The sun began to drop behind the hills. Shadows stretched across the pasture, long and dark. Caleb wiped his hands on his pants and looked at the horizon. Danger wasn't far. Bounty hunters, whispers of the sheriff, the ever-present threat of outsiders, it all waited beyond the ridge. But for this moment he allowed himself to feel something different. The faint weight of trust, of connection, in a world that had taken nearly everything from him. Evelyn stayed behind him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence, but not so close as to intrude. He wondered fleetingly what it would feel like to let that space shrink, to allow someone into his life fully again. He didn't answer. Not yet. He just nodded, and together they watched the sun sink lower, the world quieting around them, knowing that each day here was a choice, a fragile balance between safety and risk, between staying apart and drawing closer. The morning air was sharp and dry, carrying the smell of dust and worn leather. Caleb led the small wagon down the trail, reins held loosely in one hand, the other resting near his revolver. Annie sat beside him, wrapped in a blanket Evelyn had given her the night before. She kept her small hands on the edges of the seat, staring at the passing desert with wide, alert eyes. Evelyn rode just behind, scanning the horizon with a hawk-like precision. Her posture was straight, shoulders squared, but Caleb could see the subtle tension in her jaw, the way her fingers gripped the reins. She was used to running her own life, and now she had to rely at least in part on him. The wagon creaked over the uneven ground. Caleb's eyes constantly darted to the ridges and low hills around them. The trail had been quiet for the last few miles, but he knew silence like this was deceptive. Raiders or bounty hunters could be hiding anywhere. He noticed a small movement, a vulture circling high in the sky, and his hand instinctively hovered over his gun. He didn't speak, just tightened his grip on the reins, letting Evelyn see the shift. She caught it immediately. "What?" she asked, her voice low but not questioning. More an acknowledgement. "Eyes open," he said, scanning the brush. Evelyn nodded. No fear in her voice. Just preparation. Caleb's lips pressed into a thin line. "You like that?" Respect was earned in small ways, not given. Annie, oblivious to the tension, tugged on Caleb's sleeve. "Are we safe?" she asked softly. He looked down at her, meeting her eyes. He forced a smile. "As safe as we can be, kid. Keep your hands inside the wagon, all right?" She nodded, settling back against the blanket. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressed down on him, not just for the child but for Evelyn too. He wasn't just carrying a girl across the desert. He was carrying the fragile trust of someone who could easily be destroyed by the wrong choice. By midday the sun was relentless. Sweat ran down Caleb's back, burning his skin under his coat. Annie squirmed in the heat, whining quietly about her legs being tired. Evelyn noticed before he did, slowing the horses slightly. "You want to rest?" she asked, glancing at him. He shook his head. "Not yet. We'll find shade soon." The next natural pause came near a dry riverbed. Caleb guided the wagon into the shade of a cluster of mesquite trees. Dust fell from the horses as he tied them to a nearby post. Annie slid down from the wagon, barefoot on the hard dirt. She ran a hand along a cool stone, savoring the momentary relief from the sun. Evelyn dismounted carefully, wiping sweat from her forehead. "You've been pushing them hard," she said, looking at Caleb. "You're not used to slowing down." "I've been pushing myself longer than I care to admit," he said. His voice was quiet, almost vulnerable in the stillness. He turned to look at Annie, watching her crouch by the riverbed, kicking at the sand. "And now there's more than just me to think about." The acknowledgement hung between them. Evelyn's eyes softened, the tension easing slightly. She knew he wasn't used to admitting anything like that. She felt a faint pull toward him, caution battling curiosity, instinct against desire. That night they made camp near the riverbed. The fire crackled low, casting shadows over the trio. Caleb unpacked the provisions while Evelyn spread blankets for Annie. The girl sat cross-legged, humming a quiet tune to herself. When Caleb finally sat by the fire, he noticed Evelyn was closer than expected. Her eyes followed him as he unwrapped jerky, offering some to Annie first. He handed her a small piece. She took it carefully, watching him, then chewed silently. "You're good with her," Evelyn said, breaking the quiet. "I've done what needed doing before," he said, keeping his voice level. "Never really had the choice to be gentle. Not like this." Evelyn's gaze softened, and she let a small smile slip. "Maybe you're learning." He looked at her, meeting her eyes across the firelight. Something passed between them, acknowledgement of shared danger, of fragile trust. He felt the pull to close the distance, to speak more than was safe, but restraint held him back. Not just for Annie but for her too. The fire popped, and Annie yawned, curling into her blanket. Caleb moved beside her to keep her warm, feeling the small weight of responsibility press against his ribs. Evelyn settled a little distance away, yet close enough that her presence was tangible, her legs brushing the edge of his coat when she adjusted her position. They didn't speak for long. Words weren't needed yet. The fire crackled, the night air cooled, and all three of them were aware of the bond growing quietly. Caleb's mind, however, stayed alert. Even in moments of calm, danger lingered. The road ahead was long and the world was unkind. But for the first time in years he felt a thread of stability, fragile, yes, but enough to make him consider what it might be like to stay. And in the silent understanding, Evelyn and Caleb shared something neither could voice yet, a promise of protection, of trust, and maybe, eventually, something more. The wind shifted in the late afternoon, carrying a faint, metallic scent that made Caleb's instincts flare. He squinted toward the ridge. Small dust clouds moved against the horizon, irregular, deliberate, the telltale sign of riders. His jaw tightened. Bounty hunters. Fast, organized, and ruthless. He didn't panic. Never did. But his heart thumped a little faster, a reminder that he had a responsibility now, not just to himself but to Annie and increasingly to Evelyn. He scanned the surrounding terrain, rocky outcrops, shallow gullies, anything that could give them cover if needed. Evelyn noticed the tension in his posture and slowed her horse beside the wagon. "What is it?" she asked quietly, eyes narrowing. "Hunters," Caleb said. "They're close. Maybe 10 minutes away if they keep this pace." Her fingers tightened on the reins, her knuckles white. "Can we outrun them?" Caleb shook his head slightly. "Not on this trail. Not without leaving something behind. We'll have to fight if they come too close." Annie, sitting in the wagon, looked up at him. "Are they going to hurt us?" Caleb's throat tightened. He leaned down so his face was level with hers. "Not if I can help it. Stay quiet, follow every instruction, and we'll be fine." The child nodded, gripping the blanket tighter. Caleb could feel the weight of her trust pressing against him, heavier than any gun he'd carried in his life. As the riders drew nearer, Caleb maneuvered the wagon into a narrow canyon, the walls high enough to block visibility from the ridge. Evelyn followed his direction without question, slowing her horse carefully, scanning every shadow. The canyon offered little room, but it forced the hunters into a single line, a predictable path Caleb could exploit. Minutes passed in tense silence. Every sound, a distant clatter of hooves, the rustle of a dry bush, made Caleb flinch. He tried to steady his breathing, remind himself that panic would get them killed. Evelyn spoke quietly, almost to herself, but loud enough for him to hear. "I didn't think that I'd be here in this kind of danger with someone like you." Caleb's eyes flicked toward her. "Someone like me?" "You know," she said, her voice low. "A gunslinger. Someone who's broken." He didn't answer immediately. He thought of the years he'd spent alone, the choices he'd made that had left scars he carried on his body and soul. And now he had a little girl who needed him to be whole, even if he didn't feel it. And a woman who trusted him, more than she should, maybe. "You're not broken," Evelyn said, as if reading his silence. "You're careful, protective. And right now that's all that matters." He glanced at her, the corners of his mouth twitching slightly, almost a smile, but restrained. He felt an unexpected warmth spread through his chest. A quiet, dangerous pull he wasn't ready to name. The hunters' shouts echoed down the canyon. Time snapped back into sharp focus. Caleb moved quickly, whispering instructions. "Annie, stay down. Evelyn, follow my lead. Don't draw attention." The first hunter rounded a bend, a rifle in hand. Caleb was ready. The barrel of his revolver rose, fingers steady on the trigger. A flash of movement, a shot fired, gunpowder smoke curling in the canyon air. Evelyn ducked instinctively, her chest pressing briefly against his side as he rolled forward. The proximity, the heat of her body, the rapid beat of her pulse, all of it slammed into him. He forced himself to focus. The fight was close and chaotic. Dust stung their eyes. Caleb's movements were precise, controlled, every action calculated. Evelyn followed his guidance, moving with him, not against him, her trust absolute. Annie huddled in the wagon, quiet but alert, feeling the tension radiating from them both. After what felt like hours but was only minutes, the hunters retreated, the last rider disappearing over the canyon ridge. Caleb exhaled slowly, wiping sweat and dust from his forehead. He glanced at Evelyn. Her hair was loose from the wind, sweat streaking her cheeks, eyes wide but alive. "You all right?" he asked, voice low. "Yes," she said, but the corner of her mouth lifted slightly. "Thanks to you." They stood close, the tension between them no longer only about survival. The canyon was quiet again, the dust settling, but the electricity of proximity lingered. Caleb noticed the faint scent of her hair, the warmth of her arm brushing his, the way her eyes held his for a fraction longer than necessary. He swallowed, looking away first, hiding the sudden pull in his chest. Danger still surrounded them, but in that moment he realized something new. Evelyn's trust, her presence, and the way she moved with him made the threat bearable. Annie peeked from the wagon. "We safe now?" "Yes," Caleb said, keeping his voice steady. But inside he acknowledged the truth. They were safe for now, but the trail ahead was still dangerous, and every decision from this point forward mattered more than ever. Evelyn mounted her horse again, close enough that Caleb felt her shadow brush his coat. He rode beside her, quiet, aware that the canyon had changed something, the proximity, the shared danger, the unspoken tension. And he couldn't ignore it. They moved slowly down the trail, the canyon walls behind them, the horizon still uncertain, but the bond between them subtly, undeniably shifting. The first rumble of thunder came in the late afternoon, low and distant. Caleb noticed it immediately, scanning the horizon. The sky had darkened unusually fast, clouds rolling over the hills in jagged, heavy masses. Rain began to fall in thin, sharp streaks, quickly turning to sheets as the wind picked up. He guided the wagon off the trail, pulling it behind a cluster of trees and then spotting the old barn on a slight rise. Its weathered wood was cracked and worn, but it offered shelter. Evelyn led the horses, her hands steady on the reins, though Caleb could see the tension in her shoulders. "Not much shelter around here," she said, her voice low, almost overpowered by the wind. "You think this barn will hold?" "Better than nothing," he replied. His eyes flicked to the surrounding ridges, calculating angles, imagining where hunters could be waiting. "It's strong enough for the rain. We'll secure the wagon and keep the horses inside." Annie clutched Caleb's coat as they approached the barn. "It's scary," she said softly. Caleb kneeled to her level, keeping his voice calm. "I've got you," he said. "We'll be fine. Just stay close to me." He scanned the interior of the barn, noting shadows and gaps in the wood where rain leaked. He positioned Annie near the far wall, away from the door, and motioned for Evelyn to check the horses. Inside, the air smelled of dry hay mixed with wet wood. Caleb moved deliberately, tying the horses and checking the wagon. Evelyn followed, keeping her movements quiet but purposeful. Caleb noticed the faint sheen of sweat on her brow, the way her hair clung to her face in damp strands. He tried not to look, but his eyes kept drifting, noting her tense muscles, the curve of her shoulders, and the way she held herself steady despite the storm. The wind howled outside, rain hammering the barn walls. Annie sat close to Caleb, legs drawn up, still clutching her doll. Caleb rested his hand on her shoulder briefly, letting her feel his presence. The child leaned into him without a word, trusting him entirely. Evelyn moved closer to the wagon, checking the latch and making sure nothing would shift. She glanced at Caleb and their eyes met. A quiet understanding passed between them, exhaustion, relief, and something more delicate, unspoken. The storm made them acutely aware of each other. Close quarters, danger, and shared responsibility had shrunk the distance between them. Caleb shifted slightly, careful not to brush against her, yet acutely aware of her proximity. He noticed the small motions she made, adjusting her blouse, brushing damp hair behind her ear, the subtle exhale as she bent to secure a strap. Every action pulled his attention, made his chest tighten in ways he hadn't expected. Evelyn caught him watching and didn't look away immediately. Instead, she let her gaze linger, curiosity and something else, tension perhaps, in her eyes. Caleb turned his head slightly, forcing himself to focus on the work. He tied down a loose board near the wagon, feeling the heat of her presence without making contact. Annie yawned, exhausted, and Caleb tucked the blanket around her shoulders. Evelyn watched silently, her eyes softening. The child's trust in him was clear, and her own sense of responsibility toward both of them was growing heavier. The storm intensified. Rain streaked the wooden slats, and the wind shrieked through gaps in the barn. Caleb moved closer to check the horses, and Evelyn followed, their shoulders brushing briefly. The contact was accidental, but neither pulled away immediately. The proximity sparked a quiet tension, awareness of each other that neither could dismiss. "Caleb," Evelyn whispered, almost lost in the roar of the storm. "You've done more for her than anyone else could. And for me too, I suppose." He glanced at her, seeing the vulnerability she rarely showed. He wanted to respond, to reassure her, to say words that would bridge the gap between them. But instead, he nodded slightly. "Just doing what needs doing," he said, voice low, steady. Their hands brushed as he adjusted the strap on the horse. Neither pulled away. The moment stretched, charged with unspoken feeling, but neither spoke more. It was enough to acknowledge it, to feel it, and to know that when the storm passed, the distance between them would be harder to ignore. Hours passed. Caleb and Evelyn worked together, silent but coordinated, keeping the barn organized, securing the animals, checking the wagon. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and by nightfall the barn was cramped and dimly lit by a single lantern. Shadows flickered across their faces, and the air was thick with warmth, sweat, and tension. Annie slept in a corner, wrapped in the blanket. Caleb stood nearby, glancing at her before returning his attention to Evelyn. Their movements were careful, deliberate. The storm forced them into shared space, and in that shared space the unspoken grew heavier, glances lasting too long, touches almost brushing, a quiet acknowledgement that they were both aware of it. Caleb finally moved to the far side of the barn, leaning against a post. Evelyn came to stand near him, close enough that he could feel the faint heat radiating from her. Neither spoke. Outside, the wind and rain roared, but inside there was silence, dense, heavy, and full of things neither dared name. For the first time in years, Caleb felt a pull he couldn't control, a desire tempered by responsibility but undeniable. And Evelyn, sensing it, didn't pull away. She merely let herself be there, close but cautious, aware of the storm both outside and between them. The first light of dawn crept over Red Hollow, painting the town in muted gold. Caleb Mercer sat on the edge of the porch, his coat dusted with dried mud and sweat from the night's exertions. His revolver rested across his knees, cleaned and ready. He could hear the distant murmur of the town awakening, but his mind was elsewhere, focused on the coming confrontation. Annie sat beside him, small and quiet, clutching her doll tightly. She had slept through the worst of it, but now she sensed the tension radiating from him. Caleb knelt briefly to brush a stray strand of hair from her face. "You stay here," he said quietly, though his voice carried a weight of finality. "Don't move until I tell you." The little girl nodded, trusting him completely, her wide eyes reflecting the rising sun. Caleb's chest tightened. She was more than a responsibility, she was a reminder of everything he'd lost and everything he could still protect. Evelyn emerged from the barn, her blouse damp from the early morning dew. She moved with purpose, yet her eyes betrayed the fear she tried to hide. "You ready?" she asked, voice low but steady. Caleb stood, slipping his hat low over his brow. "As ready as I'll ever be." He cast a quick glance toward the hills. Dust clouds in the distance signaled the bounty hunters approaching. Their formation was disciplined, the men riding hard, guns gleaming in the early light. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he didn't hesitate. He had planned for this, every ridge, alley, and rooftop memorized, every movement accounted for. Evelyn mounted her horse beside him, close enough that their shoulders brushed. The touch was brief but grounding. For a fraction of a second the world narrowed. Him, her, Annie, and the fight ahead. No words were spoken, but the silent acknowledgement passed between them, they were in this together. The first shots rang out as the hunters entered town, forcing people into doorways and alleyways. Caleb moved quickly, guiding Evelyn and finding cover behind a stack of crates outside the general store. His eyes scanned for angles, calculating threats, predicting movements. Fear was present but controlled, it sharpened his senses rather than weakening him. Evelyn's eyes were fierce as she followed his lead, crouching low, peering around crates, a rifle in hand. Her trust in him allowed her to act with focus rather than panic. Caleb noticed how her hair caught the sunlight, the curve of her shoulders as she braced herself. For a moment, amidst the chaos, he was aware of the pull between them, the desire that had been simmering under the surface through long days, quiet nights, and close quarters. The gunfight intensified. Dust and smoke filled the main street. Caleb fired carefully, each shot precise. He moved with purpose, guiding Evelyn through the chaos, signaling when to advance or retreat. They worked seamlessly, instinctive in coordination. Annie's small voice called from the edge of the town. Caleb risked a glance and saw her hiding behind a water trough, wide-eyed but unharmed. Relief coursed through him, but it was fleeting, the fight wasn't over. The final hunter rounded a corner, charging recklessly. Caleb's hand was steady, the shot rang out and the threat fell. The street fell silent, punctuated only by the ragged breathing of the survivors. Caleb lowered his weapon, scanning the scene. Every threat neutralized. Evelyn approached, brushing dust from her skirt, and for the first time she allowed herself to exhale fully. Caleb met her gaze. No words were needed. She stepped closer, and he felt the subtle warmth of her presence. Their hands touched briefly, brushing fingertips, lingering just enough for acknowledgement. Annie ran toward them, calling Caleb's name. He knelt, gathering her into his arms. She hugged him tightly, and for a moment he felt the full weight of his role, protector, father, and now perhaps something more. Evelyn moved closer, standing beside them, and finally, Caleb let himself exhale completely. The danger was gone. For the first time in years he felt the possibility of peace. "Looks like we made it," Evelyn said softly, her voice carrying relief and something deeper. Caleb nodded, keeping his arm around Annie, then glanced at Evelyn. His voice was low but steady. "We did. Together." The morning sun bathed the town in light. The air smelled of smoke and sage, of dust settling after violence. Caleb looked at the horizon, then back at Evelyn and Annie. The girl's trust, Evelyn's presence, it had changed him. For the first time he allowed himself to believe he could be the man he never was. A protector, a father, a partner. The scars on his body and soul were still there, but they no longer defined him. Redemption wasn't something handed down, It was earned in the quiet moments, in the choices made under pressure, in the love and trust of those who believed in him. Annie laughed, running ahead to explore the street now safe. Evelyn brushed a strand of hair from her face and smiled at Caleb. He reached for her hand, letting the brief contact linger, a promise unspoken but understood. Red Hollow was quiet now, the threat gone. Caleb Mercer finally allowed himself to smile. He was home, in the town, with the little girl who had saved him, and the woman who had reminded him that he could feel again. They stood together on the porch, the wind carrying the scent of sage and sun-warmed earth. The past remained behind them. Ahead there was life, and for the first time in a long time, hope. Caleb looked at Evelyn and Annie and thought, maybe this is what it means to be a man. To protect. To love. To be present. And for the first time he was ready to be all three. The chapter, and the story, ended not with questions but with certainty. A family formed, danger survived, and a future wide open waiting.